Welcome to Chapter 13. We're talking about CSS Advanced Selectors and Specificity. In this first part, we're talking about advanced selectors. First off, when you're dealing with CSS, you want to have something that deals with applying the same set of rules to multiple segments on a page or a site. You can do this by using the class attribute by targeting multiple elements. For example, if you want to format the email address on your site as the exact same across all your pages, having the same color and font for your company name, or even stylizing the navigation bar across the whole site. It'll be easier to identify these items using a class versus the actual elements themselves. You can use both, but the better idea is to use a class. That way the rules can be applied to multiple segments at once. Here's an example of a class. You have your first p tag with a paragraph, another p tag that says a special paragraph that has a class equal to special. Class is the attribute, special is the value, and then you have another p tag saying this is another paragraph. In the CSS, we have the p tag specifying the color, and then the special class that specifies a different color and a different font size. If you take a look in the white box, you see exactly what the output is of the specified CSS. But let's break this down a bit. Class syntax basically means that you're adding the class attribute to the actual element in your HTML. In the associated CSS, instead of specifying just the element, you can specify a class. So these two match. You have the class value in the HTML and the class specified in CSS. But one of the big things that makes classes different than your HTML elements is you have the presence of a period specifying a class. If you look in the value of your HTML, there is no period. That's because this is a class name. Class names can be anything you like as long as they don't start with a number and they don't have spaces. You can use underscores, you can use dashes, you can use pretty much any symbol you would like, along with alphanumeric characters, as long as it doesn't start with a number and doesn't have a space. As long as you name it anything you want and specify the CSS, making sure that the class itself starts with a dot to identify it, then your class can be named anything you want, as long as you have the set of rules that allows the element to be styled. When you're dealing with inline elements, you can also use what's called a span tag. For example, to use the special paragraph again, you can see that the second p tag has the class of special. And special, of course, has the specified styling to make the second p tag a little different than the rest. Additionally, you also have a span tag, which allows you to identify inline items. And with this, you also have the class attribute in the value of special. Both classes have the same value, and the class special has the same rules for both elements. So this way, instead of specifying the p tag and a span, now you can identify just the class special and have the same styling. In the white box, you actually see a good example of what the span tag can do to an inline element. If you also have items that are only used once, instead of identifying multiple elements, you can target a unique element using an ID. An ID works the exact same way as a class, but whereas a class can be used multiple times on a page, an ID should only be used once. If you have multiple IDs of the same value, then your validator is going to spit back at you and saying, hey, this is a problem, you need to fix it. Just like with class, the value in CSS matches the value in your HTML as long as the ID attribute is there. Just about any element can have a class, and just about any element can have an ID. But what makes IDs different from classes is the fact that you have the # in front of the CSS ID. Whereas in the HTML, you don't have that. Again, just like class, you are identifying this and then calling it in your CSS by using the # in front of it. So when it comes to using a class or an ID, you should know these specific items in order to determine which one to use. For a class, you are applying formatting that will be repeated on the page, such as section headings and uniform content styling. For example, staff bios, product details, or even calendar events. An ID targets a specific region or element that is unique on the page, such as main navigation, your document footer, or even a logo. Again, classes can be used multiple times, whereas IDs should only be used once per page. Let's talk about grouping selectors. If you have a set of rules that is easily repeated by two different elements, instead of specifying one and then specifying the other and having the same rules, what you can do is actually merge these two and do what's called grouping selectors. If we take a look at the previous example again, you see that we have an H1 and an H2, both have the exact same rules, but by replacing the H1 rule with a comma to list the H1 and the H2, now we have the same set of rules for both. The exact same result will come out, but in this case, you can actually modify this single set of declarations and have it affect both the H1 and the H2, making it easier for you to type and easier for the browser to process what elements should have that specific styling. For universal selectors, if you want to apply something such as box sizing and border box to every element, instead of listing all 87 of them, such as ABBR, address, area, so on, to var, VIDE, and WBR, you can actually use something called a universal selector and apply a single rule or a single group of rules to every element on the site. And that is done by using an asterisk. Basically, in the computer language, an asterisk is a wildcard, which means that anything can go in it. And by using the asterisk, you are actually applying this set of rules to everything on the page. Next, let's talk about descendant selectors. In this example, we have navlink as a class for different anchor points inside list items, inside an unordered list, inside of a nav. Well, the CSS specifies a class of navlink and has a certain set of rules. But instead of having to go through and write class navlink, class navlink, class navlink, and maybe mistyping something, we can actually cross out all these classes right here and actually use what's called a descendant selector, which makes it easier for us and easier for the browser to identify what's being done. So instead of using a class of navlink, we can actually use the nav and then the A anchor element to specify what items we want to stylize. We are still identifying the nav when it comes to what area we want to do, but then by using the anchor tag after a nav, this is basically saying, hey, all the anchor tags inside of a nav should have this specified set of rules. So instead of specifying the classes, we're now using a descendant selector to specify the nav and then all the anchors inside the nav, even though there's an unordered list and a list item between the anchor tag and the nav. However, when it comes to descendant selectors, make sure to avoid bloated descendant selectors when possible. So instead of starting with the HTML, then going into the body, then the header, then the nav, then the UL, then the LI, then the A, you can make it nice and short by just saying nav and A. You are specifying the nav element as the parent of the anchor tags, and then the anchor element as basically a child of the nav. You are specifying the anchor tags inside the nav to make it easier for the browser to identify, instead of starting from the root element, the HTML, and then breaking it down from there. Makes it easier for you, makes it easier on the browser, makes it easier for everyone. The display property is probably one of the most common elements in CSS. This actually allows you to display items inline, block, inline and block, or even removing the element from the page. By saying display block, this converts inline elements to block level. Basically, it stacks elements vertically versus side by side. You have display inline, which converts block elements to inline, the exact opposite of the one previous. You can say display inline dash block, which makes elements display inline but allows for styling of block properties like widths and margins. This is a great tool for navigation buttons when created from unordered lists. And last but not least, display of none, which removes the element from the page. It's still in the code, but as far as CSS and display is concerned, the element is removed from the page. There is no block that is relating to the actual element. There is no spacer for it. The element is completely removed from the page. When it comes to child selectors, you want to make sure you specify exactly which elements inside other elements you're going to be identifying. Take this example right here. Say we want to modify this p tag. Well, we don't want to modify the other p tags, such as the one inside of the div that says follow us. We just want to specify the hours. We could do this by using a class, an ID, or we can just use a child selector. And a child selector basically looks like this. It has the item, in this case the footer, then it has the right triangle sign, and then the p tag. This is basically saying that any of these elements, in case p tags, inside the footer should have the style specified, but nothing else beyond that. So if we have style specified for this, it's only going to be applied to the hours p tag versus the follow us p tag. If we have adjacent sibling selectors, basically what we're doing is we're specifying this right here and not the other p tag. We can also specify this using an ID or a class, or just using a sibling selector, basically saying that, hey, I want the element that is adjacent to the element I'm identifying to have the styles I want. So in this case, you can say footer plus p to specify that first p instead of all the p's, because it is an adjacent sibling. Basically, it's right next to the previous one, so therefore it's going to get the styles. If you want to have a general sibling selector, this is basically saying that I want to stylize all the p tags, but not the other p tags that are inside other elements. I can use the tilde, so footer, then tilde, then p. For those that don't speak Spanish or aren't familiar with the Spanish language, the tilde is a little squiggly line located right next to the 1 key. By saying footer and then tilde and p, we're specifying the p tags inside of footer, but not the p tags inside other elements inside of footer. If you don't understand this, I recommend playing around with child, adjacent sibling, and general sibling selectors so that you get a better understanding about how things can work out. In the Code With Me videos, we'll actually be using all of these to give you a good example of how these can be used. Next, let's talk about attribute selectors. When you're dealing with other selectors in the page, you can actually use what's called an attribute selector to specify exactly what you want. For example, p, then square brackets, and class with square brackets. This is specifying that every p tag that has a class attribute should get the specified styles. Basically saying that any p tag that doesn't have a class, regardless of what it is not going to get the styles. So with the HTML code to match, you have the p tag, the class attribute, and then the special value. Next, if you want to specify a specific class, you can technically say p square bracket class equals solution in quotes, and then square brackets. Basically, that means that every p tag with the class name of exactly solution will get the specified rules. You can also use p dot solution to get the same result. Next you have p square brackets class the caret symbol, which is located on the 6th key, equals and then a value, in this case can. This basically means that any p tag with the class name that starts with can will get the specified styles. For example, p class equals candy. Next we have p square bracket class asterisk equals can. This means that every p tag with the class name that contains the word can should get the styling. For example, p class equals scant. Last but not least, you have p tag square bracket class $sign equals can. And this means that every p tag with the class name that ends in can will get the styling, such as p class equals pecan, or pecan depending on where you're from. Next we have pseudo classes, and again, if you're very confused about all this, don't worry, the Code With Me videos will give you good examples of all of this so you can see it in action versus just me sitting here talking to you. But pseudo classes select the state of an element. This is most likely used with anchor tags, and with more modern browsers can be used with other tags such as div tags. But not all browsers support pseudo classes for div tags, so the chances are the number one use you'll have for pseudo classes is the anchor tag, which is perfectly fine. A pseudo class selects the state of an element. For example, you have anchor tag colon, then the word link. This selects a hyperlink that has not been navigated to or visited yet. Next you have a colon visited, and yes, that is past tense. This selects a hyperlink that has been visited. As long as it's in your browser's history, it is declared as visited on the client's computer. Next we have a colon hover. This selects a link that has the cursor hovering over it. This is really useful when you're trying to create some kind of hover effect to make the link change color, become bigger, change the background, or even have a little animation to let the user know the link that they're about to click is the link they want to click. For example, if you've ever browsed Google and you've selected a list of search results, you may notice that whenever you go over some of the blue words, the underline appears and disappears based on whatever your mouse is hovering over. That is based on the a colon hover pseudo class. Lastly, we have a colon active, and this is a link that is being clicked on or has received focus from tab. If you recall from the previous lectures, we used accessibility and the tab key to navigate a page without the mouse. By using the active pseudo class, this basically means that whenever a link is being clicked on or has focus from the tab, the link itself or the element that has the active pseudo class will change. Again, if you don't understand this, don't worry, we'll go over all of these in the Code With Me videos. Next, let's talk about some more advanced systems in targeting the first or last child inside of an element. Now, for those of you that aren't too familiar with coding concepts, a child is basically an element that is inside of another element. In this case, the main element is the parent, and the p tags are the children of main. Now, don't worry, that doesn't mean that main gave birth to it. It just talks about the fact that the p tags are inside the main parent. And to select the first or last child inside of the element, you can say main and then p colon first dash child, which basically does the exact same thing as an adjacent sibling. However, in case you don't want to use the adjacent sibling system for some odd reason, you can select first child, which 90% of the time selects the correct one. If you want to select the last one, then you can say p colon last child. And that basically means that the last child element that is a p tag inside of the main will be selected. And then from there you can modify it however you want. However, it may have some odd issues when you're dealing with different elements, such as if you say P colon first child, then it doesn't really select anything because the first child in main is the H1, in which case you would select the H1 colon first child. Because the first child of main is the H1, that's what you're specifying. Then the last element is small, so you could say small colon last child to specify the small element is the last child of the parent element. In this case, P first child and P last child don't give you the same results. If you want to target the first or last occurrence, instead of saying first or last child, you can say first or last of type. That is 3 words with dashes in between. So in this case, you can say regardless of whatever the first child is, whether an H1, anchor tag, image, whatever, you can specify the first of type and then P to specify the first P tag in the element. Same goes with the last of type by specifying P last of type to select the last P tag inside the parent element. Now if you want to target any child or occurrence, you can use what's called the nth type or the nth child. So for example, if you say P nth child, that's 2 words, and then in parentheses the number 2, that means that it's going to target the first paragraph because it is the second child of the element. If you say P colon nth child 4, it targets nothing because the fourth child of the main element is an H2. If you say P nth of type 4, then that's going to select the fourth paragraph because paragraph 4 is the fourth paragraph that's a child. If you say nth of type, and that's supposed to have an O instead of, and you say even, then that's going to say paragraphs 2 and 4, not because they have even numbers in them, but because they are even numbered paragraphs that are children inside the main element. If you say H2 colon nth child 2, that targets nothing because the second child is a P tag and there are no H2s. If you say H1 nth of type 2, that's going to select heading B because heading B is the second heading that's a child. However, when it comes to using items like this, you may get some unexpected behavior. To have a general form like this, we have email, first name, last name, age, height, gender, password, and date. And if you try to use the nth of type or nth child, it may not give you the exact same results. Let's break it down. First off, if you say input nth of type even, that means it's going to target first name, age, gender, and date because that is the input types you are going to work with. Well, let's see, first name, age, gender, and date, 2, 4, 6, and 8. That works perfectly. Input type equals text. Now this is using the same concept as before with the selectors using the classes, but instead we're using the format type or the attribute of type. In this case, we're saying type equals text and then nth of type even. Well, shouldn't that select last name and height? Not really. It's going to select the first name, age, and gender because of the text attribute. The text value. The first name is the first actual text input because the first actual input is email. So it's going to target first name, skip last name because it's odd, get age because it's even, height is odd, gender is even, and then we have password and date, so it doesn't pick up anything else. If we say input type equals text and nth of type odd, basically what we're saying is select the odd input elements and style those only with the type equals text. In this case, we're saying last name and height because out of all the items that have the type equals text attribute, and value, we only have, well, 5 in this case: first name, last name, age, height, and gender. Well, last name is technically odd because it's going to select the last name field, and then height because that's also odd based on the fact that all the inputs are, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even and odd. Now, if you're going to use the child pseudo-selectors, you want to make sure that you're selecting the actual one that can work. Using this basic example, you can use H1 quite well to select first child, first of type, nth child, and nth of type. All of these work. However, with paragraph, you can use first of type, nth child, and nth of type. If you use p : first child, that doesn't select anything because the first child of the main element is an H1, not a p tag. So therefore, it won't work. Next, let's talk about pseudo elements. These are, well, neat little trick items that can work and in most cases will work. But instead of using 1: use 2:. This example right here allows you to select the first letter of a p tag inside the header elements. You can increase the font size to 200% and decrease the letter spacing as much as you want. But based on this is a neat little visual effect that you can have for the different elements. Chances are, the more you get into this, the more interesting it can get, but please don't try to do more than you can handle. There's a lot to this, and unless you actually go through and experiment with what can and can't be done, then there's really no way to know what can and can't be done because you don't know what it is. So please, take your time, experiment with this, do the research, and find out more. Okay, I know that was quite a lot. There's a lot to cover with advanced selectors in CSS, but hopefully you got at least a general understanding about what the advanced selectors can do. In the next video, we'll talk about specificity and dealing with the overriding factors when it comes to how CSS rules are laid out. If you have any questions about this or anything in Chapter 13, please send me an email or hit me up on Twitter, and I'll get back to you with the best possible answer.